Hello, I'm Amanda Walker, and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing America right now. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump and the reshaping of the political moment. The attack on the former president marks one of the most serious incidents of political violence in recent US history. Coming up, we'll examine the worrying rise in these kinds of acts.
When violent events occur, we tend to see approval of violence in the public increase. And so the way that we respond as an electorate to a violent event is to say, well, maybe violence is okay.
I proudly accept your nomination for president.
We'll also look at what this historic moment could mean for the election campaign and November's outcome.
Very scary. I am afraid that it could happen again, and the fact that there was a breach in this modern day is not okay.
Now, America is no stranger to these types of incidents. Let's take a look back at some of the most prominent.
The attack on Donald Trump is the latest in a long history of political violence in the US. In 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot dead as he attended the theater.
President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be...
Nearly 100 years later, John F. Kennedy was killed as his presidential motorcade drove through Dallas, Texas.
I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
5 years after that, his brother, Robert Kennedy, was killed on the campaign trail. In 1981, Ronald Reagan survived an assassination attempt after giving a Union speech at a Washington hotel. Congresswoman Gabby Giffords also survived an attempt on her life after she was shot at a constituent meeting in 2011. The angry rhetoric of more recent years has inflamed the increasingly polarized political climate. In 2017, Republican Steve Scalise was shot at a congressional baseball practice. In 2020, the FBI foiled a plot to kidnap Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
I have asked specifically from this White House to bring the heat down. I have asked the Republican leaders in our state legislature to bring the heat down.
The husband of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi, was attacked with a hammer inside his home in 2022. This latest act of violence comes at a time where people are left wondering what happens next.
And that question is worrying a lot of people. We may have been here before, but rarely in such volatile times and right in the middle of a toxic political campaign. Do you worry about this creating a climate of violence?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know, it's creating it, it's there. The fear is there. Our nation isn't where it was a few years ago.
It's very scary. I am afraid that it could happen again, and the fact that there was a breach in this modern day is not okay.
You know, I get the feeling that, because it's so divisive and things like that just happen, I don't know why we seem to normalize this stuff, but, it's kind of scary. You may not want to be out with your wife and kids and, have your MAGA hat on going down the street just for fear of what some random unknown may come out of.
It's being normalized.
Oh, very much so, which is super sad.
In recent years, there has been a surge of threats against elected officials across the US. Data shows that political violence is on the rise. Liliana Mason is one of the political scientists at the center of that research. I started by asking her, as an expert, what her first thoughts were when she heard about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump.
I was very worried. One thing that we found in our research is that when violent events occur, we tend to see approval of violence in the public increase. And so the way that we respond as an electorate to a violent event is to say, well, maybe violence is okay. More people think maybe violence is okay.
Really? So are we in danger of normalizing violence?
Well, this is the real, I think the real threat here is the possibility of a sort of cascading effect where violence occurs, approval of violence increases, another violent event then becomes more likely, approval goes up even more, and we could end up in a vicious cycle, which can always get to a tipping point where we lose control of whether violence continues happening or not.
And in terms of the research, I really want to dig into the research that you've done and the data that it's presented. But it seems to be a trend that when Trump is perceived to be under threat, violence increases. Tell me more about that.
Right. So first of all, FBI statistics have shown that over the last 10 years or so, violent domestic terrorism, but political violence in general is coming from the right wing more than the left wing. So significantly more political violence when Trump is around comes from the right wing. When we think about Trump himself, we ran some experiments where we asked people to read a quote from Trump or Biden saying violence is never acceptable, ever. And what we found was that simply reading that one quote from either Trump or Biden reduced people's approval of violence. So leaders have a lot of power to allow their supporters to take a step back and reassess. If they don't do that, though, then we see more violence occurring. And so their leadership is actually really important. The other thing that I'll say is that we've been tracking approval of violence in the electorate since 2017. And what we found is that during both of Trump's impeachments, Republican approval of violence shot up. And also there has been a very worrying trend in the last few years of elected officials, election administrators and judges and their staff receiving a lot of threats. So they're not actually violent acts, but they are very violent threats. And that has largely been coming from the right.
Obviously, this was an extremely high-profile attack, but these things are going on across the country on a much more regular basis, aren't they, when it comes to local officials, as you say, being threatened? What do these threats, this intimidation, what form do they take?
So most of these threats are anonymous, and it's very hard to find the perpetrator. The only data that we have is from asking the elected officials to tell us whether they've been threatened. But we have an increasing amount of data on this. And what we're finding is that the numbers of both elected officials and sort of people who work in the system, the political system, the number of those people who have been threatened has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, sometimes quintupled over the last 5 to 6 years.
Really?
And I guess the good news about that is that these threats have not really been acted upon. So there haven't been actual violent acts against most of these people, but they're receiving death threats to themselves and to their families, often to their children. And it is extremely intimidating, and it's very hard to ask someone to stay in a job where their children are being threatened with violence and death. And so there is an effect that we have seen of people being intimidated out of their jobs. They just stop doing those jobs. And the people who are targeted tend to be women and people of color, overwhelmingly. And so what that's doing is changing the makeup of who runs our government and who makes democracy work. We're eliminating women and people of color from those spaces because those are the people who are being threatened the most.
There is research out there as well that suggests that support for political violence increases when people believe that the other side supports it. Tell me more about that.
So we've asked a number of different questions about violence to Americans, just sort of a random sample of Americans. Usually what we see is about 10 to 20% of Americans approve of political violence to some degree, which is not a lot. I mean, it's too many, but it's still
pretty surprising though that anyone approves.
Right.
That
says that it could be.
That's a few million people, right?
Oh yeah, it's the equivalent of a few million people. So, but then if we then say, well, what if the other side is violent first? What if people in the other party are violent first? Then do you approve of violence? And that number then goes up from 10 to 20% to 40 to 50. Some of our most recent data I just looked at this morning, up to 60% of people saying it's okay to use violence if they start it. And that's what we're really worried about, is this type of retribution cycle happening where once someone feels attacked, they feel much more able to attack back.
You touched on it at the beginning, but the language that is used by leaders, and we know that Donald Trump, it's out there, we've heard it, does use much more violent language than Joe Biden. If Donald Trump stopped doing that in the next 4 months, what kind of election campaign do you think we might have? Would it be more peaceful?
It would make me feel better about the chance of violence emerging.
So what he says and doesn't say would have an actual impact.
Very much matters. And the problem is that he doesn't, when violence does occur, he doesn't come out and say, stop it. I don't like this. I don't want any of my supporters to do this. That's what we should be hearing from a responsible leader. And usually we do hear people like Joe Biden say, this is not part of a democracy. This is not who we are. This is not how we do things. We have a democracy in order to have a peaceful transition of power. And the peaceful part is very important. And so any responsible leader is trying to present that latter message of, this is about maintaining a peaceful transfer of power. And by attacking your political opponents, you're disrupting democracy itself. Trump never says that. And often, or if he does say it, it's sort of under duress because something really terrible like January 6th is happening. And at that point, he only told people to stop after many, many hours of them taking over the Capitol and defiling, all kinds of American symbols and icons. What I would say is the fact, there's so many examples of Trump reacting to violent events in an encouraging way, of him saying, either in his rally to say, like, you guys should go attack that protester, or even with when Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, he made jokes out of it. He really belittled the entire situation. And of course, January 6th is like the best example of this, where he just refused to tell people to stop. And in fact, there are quotes from people inside the Capitol who were saying, someone said, on video, someone said, should we stop? And the other one says, Trump hasn't told us to stop. And so they keep going. So we have real suggestive anecdotal evidence that Trump himself could have stopped that violence, which is the most terrifying, I think, political violence that we've seen in America in a very long time. And he just tends not to do that. And so there's the violent atmosphere that we see is partly a result of a political leader of one of our two parties not condemning violence when it occurs. The most important, what I try to do when talking about political violence is to, first of all, explain that it's a serious problem and it's very frightening. But we don't want to tell people who are part of a democracy to feel frightened about participating in their own democracy. And in fact, the total number of people who do violent things is vanishingly small. And so the vast majority of our democratic system is very, very safe and works the way it always works and will work the way it always works in November. And so we have very brave Americans who are working in elections, who are volunteering their own time to help our democracy work. We have people whose entire job it is to run elections freely and safely. And all of those people are doing their jobs right now. And so the fact that this is a frightening thing, it's important for us to know about, but it shouldn't intimidate Americans out of participating in their own democracy, because it's not very many places. And we have a responsibility to support our own democracy, to participate in it, and to have our voices heard. And we don't want people to be scared away from that by a couple of violent actors.